Hi, welcome. Welcome to adopting Theia Insights from an initial contributor. Thank you for joining this talk. All right. My name is Paul Maréchal. I'm a software developer at Ericsson, Canada, and I've been mostly working on Eclipse Theia as a committer and maintainer for 4 years now. So the goal of this talk is to kind of give you the essence of many lessons that we learned trying to use Theia and overcome the issues and using them internally. I won't talk about too many things within Ericsson, but just really the lessons learned. And I will start with a small tour of Eclipse Theia in case people are not very familiar with the framework. So Theia is this framework to make IDE applications, and it comes as a bunch of NPM packages. Currently, 45 of those packages are extensions that you can use to get features in your applications. We also distribute and publish a CLI in order to build your applications and bootstrap everything together. And you can find all of that under the Theia namespace on NPM. So that's what you would essentially be looking at. So a Theia application is just a collection of Theia extensions, essentially. And in order to create such thing, you use the Theia CLI. And what it does is that given your dependencies on your application, it will crawl your node modules, which is where everything is installed, and collect every single Theia extension. And this collection mechanism is so that then we can create static files that import everything required to create your application, essentially. You should also use the CLI in order to check for dependency issues, and you can use it to start your application, but it's not really necessary. So obviously, when you will make your application, you will have a lot of dependencies and a lot of packages. And so a Theia extension, it's just a package with this Theia extension field that defines a bunch of modules which are used depending on the entry point, because your extension might contribute a feature to be displayed or executed in your browser. So you would use the front-end entry point for that in your extensions. And you might want to add logic on the server to answer requests from the front end, so that would be the back-end entry point. And Theia is a very distributed application, so there's a lot of different runtimes you can program for, such as front-end on Electron, all kinds of stuff. So the nice things with Theia extensions is that it's not just an extension mechanism, it's actually how every single feature in the framework is implemented, and that you can also use to add your own features in your own applications. So should you write your own Theia extensions, you would have the same power as what we are doing in the main trunk of Theia. So everything goes through inversify bindings. I won't go into too many details about how this works. But it's basically binding abstractions or names to abstractions, such as, let's take the language service, and you can bind it to an actual implementation. So it gives this indirection where you can come up with interfaces that represent your abstractions for what the service should do, and then the implementation is a detail, and you can rebind things. And in this case, you can see that someone rebinds actually the language service using Monaco languages implementation. So what does it do? I don't know, but it must be related to Monaco, which is, by the way, the editor we use coming from Monaco and VS Code. So the most minimalistic application you could make using Theia would look like this. So this is the content of a package.json to create an application. You have just name version, the entry point of the application is located somewhere under generated sources. And as you can see, under dependencies, I only have one extension. And so the thing is with Theia extensions is that they are highly interdependent. So by just specifying that, I'm already telling that, okay, I need this extension that handles the VS Code extension support so that I can use the VS Code APIs within my applications. But of course, it cannot run just with this single extension on. There's like you need terminals and editors and preferences. And so those are most likely dependencies of this extension. And as per the installation process of your NPM packages or extensions, those extra Theia extensions are also downloaded on your disk. Those are called transitive dependencies. And this is what makes it work, where you can just define plugin X VS Code, and everything required to get that working will be pulled. And this is just an extract of one of the files generated for this application I just showed you. So you can see that there is much more things included in your app than just add Theia/plugin X VS Code. And so this is something really to understand about Theia apps. It's that it's just a basic NPM package. And so you deal with all the NPM dependency dependencies, essentially, because let's consider this bogus Theia application. In this case, I still have my dependency on plugin X VS Code, and I add a new one on some other Theia package. And what this actually gets resolved to is this thing. So the problem here is that when we first made the application, maybe we were working on 129, and so the log file that is used to make sure that you can reproduce your builds pinned versions to what was available at the time. And when you targeted a newer dependency, it starts to pull a different version. When this happens, you have a cascading effect of transitive dependencies being installed and package getting duplicated, and this is not really good for your application. You will experience runtime crashes that might be weird to understand. So really, and this kind of situations happen when you try to upgrade your application from one version of the framework to the other. So that's something that you have to be aware of to understand how your dependency work and how you can end into this kind of situations, essentially. But so, like written, it's very important to understand the NPM dependency mechanism so that you don't end up in these situations. And secondly, we implemented actually a tool within the CLI in order to detect those issues. So that's Theia check Theia versions. Having said all of that, then there's a good question about should you extend the framework or implement your features using the Theia extension or a VS Code extension, because the Theia framework is able to consume VS Code extensions. The advice I would have here is to first try to see how to implement it as a VS Code extension. And the reason is that the API is very stable, and also it makes your code or your extension much more versatile, right? You don't, because if you make a Theia extension, you will be locked into Theia, for instance, and maybe you can reuse it somewhere. So that's the benefits of using a VS Code extension: stability and portability. Though, when working with Theia, make sure that the version of the framework that you use supports the APIs that are required for your extension, because essentially we are constantly trying to improve the support by implementing new APIs, but we are just not there yet where 100% of it is complete, but the progress is ongoing. And if all of that fails, then you can start thinking about making Theia extension. One of the difficulties with Theia extensions that you have to consider also when implementing your feature in order to be able to upgrade the framework is that some of the bindings that you may want to rebind in order to implement your feature are not as stable as others. In the framework, we have contribution points that are most definitely stable because these are designed to be extended or replaced. But we've seen already in some instances that people want to do something really, a customization that wouldn't be able to be done without modifying internals of your IDE or your application. And so you may start to rebind internals of a framework. And so that's all good, but those are not as stable as contribution points, which were designed to be extensible in the first place. And then lastly, you have the least stable components in the framework, where if you try to rebind implementation details of a framework, it's all good, but brace yourself for when you do the upgrade, because as per the maintenance of a framework, we may want to clean up internals, refactor APIs, and implementation details. So we're doing our best effort trying to not break those things in open source, but it may happen. And it's one of the leading causes of, so when you upgrade the version of a framework for your application, this is what you may expect to encounter. So it's not as bad as it sounds, but it's just something to be ready for, right? And this is something that enters the equation when you decide to implement a Theia extension. So like I said, Theia supports VS Code extensions. As per the community release, which is released every 3 months now in order to promote stability of the framework, we support VS Code API 153.2. I think it is currently at 170.11. But I don't have a graph of data, but we have been doing massive work in order to improve VS Code API support. And in order to help also making the choice and understanding what is available for you to use from the VS Code API in Theia, we developed something called the API comparator. So if you go on this page, you will be able to see every single API point that you may want to use from the VS Code API, when it was contributed to the VS Code API, and which version of Theia supports it. So I think it's pretty straightforward, but the only weird case is that we have 2 situations. Partial support means that maybe there is a new data structure that VS Code introduced, and that some of the existing API are supposed to support now, but we only support the previous types. And so as long as your extension handles those types, it's fine. But it's just, yeah, we're missing a few things, hence the partial. And not shown, but there is also a stub property, which means that the feature is actually not implemented, but in order for you to be able to consume extensions that may use those features, even though Theia doesn't currently support it, it would still work by providing data that makes sense in the context of this API, but doesn't do anything in reality. And one of the points I would like to make is about, before extending the framework or creating a VS Code extension or Theia extension, to understand a little bit how to integrate tools and what it means to integrate things together. So previously with proper IDEs, those beasts, like I'm thinking Visual Studio, which is massive. I'm thinking maybe a bit of Eclipse. Those tools were meant to abstract a lot of things away and do a lot of things out of the box. And it was useful, and it still is. But nowadays, the trend seems to be more into smart editors, where the main purpose is mostly to work on code, don't do much out of the box, but to be able to do more if provided with a proper extension. What that means is, let's just looking at VS Code to understand a bit the philosophy behind what it means to extend such an editor. So in their case, they looked at what it means to work on code and with code, and found across all languages the common denominator. So, sorry. So in every case, you always want to navigate from your functions to the declarations, things like this. You want that you want to be able to inspect elements on your objects when you're writing them, so that you don't have to look at the documentation. Maybe you want to see the errors in your editor as you write and make mistakes. So all those things are common across all languages, and VS Code essentially implements the support for all of that. But yeah, it's like empty sockets. So on the same topic, if we look at the language server protocol, it's considered to be first a technical fit, because designing such a protocol and with the amount of stability that this has is, well, a technical fit. But it's more so a collaboration fit, because what this allowed VS Code to do, or Microsoft, sorry, is to develop these empty sockets by focusing on the editor and supporting those features, but leaving the grunt of the work to the people that would be motivated to do it. So what this means is, for instance, if we look at the C++ community with ClangD, what happened is that people are already working on the compiler and trying their best to make the errors as good as possible. And when VS Code opened the IDE with this LSP, what happened is that people could extract the features from the compiler to make ClangD, which is a language server from it. And the neat thing is that with this architecture, you don't need to implement your language logic in JavaScript. You can use whatever language you want, and communities just jumped on it. Same thing goes with the AP, except that instead of having the communities being eager to work on making the language servers themselves, the debugging community is a bit more weird. Essentially, most of the tools either already have a good graphical UI or maybe a good command line UI. And so people are not super keen into implementing new protocol to remote control their tool. But so the approach that VS Code took this way is much more pragmatic, of saying, all right, what we are going to do is this generic protocol where people can write a wrapper around those debuggers that have very nice interactive interfaces, but that are not compatible with VS Code, right? So again, people outside of Microsoft and outside of the IDE community could focus on just implementing those things. And lastly, yeah, it's the whole concept of what is a plugin in VS Code. In most cases, at least with the most popular plugins on VS Code, they don't do a lot of stuff. Plugins, the logic is mostly about gluing every feature coming from tools that already exist into VS Code. And so this is, yeah, it's like plugins are mostly just UI integration. So this goes, so what I wanted to show here is this concept of trying to find a way to get to a modular a point where things are modular. And what I mean by this is just like those plugins that actually rely on tools which can be run without VS Code. So if you were to implement a complex build feature or build workflow directly into a Theia extension or VS Code extension, then the question is, all right, this extension must be hooked to an editor to work. And now I want to run it in the CI. How does that work? Do I run VS Code in my CI in order to run my plugin? Very sorry. And so you get modularity when you have reusable components. And a reusable component is something with minimal dependencies, because the more dependencies you have, the harder it is to reuse. So my advice here, again, is to avoid dependence on an editor, Theia, VS Code, or whatever, so that you can develop. Okay, so yeah, the idea is to develop tools that can be run as a standalone, but that can then be wrapped using whatever extension model or mechanism you guys want to use. Because speaking of integration, I love this example. So there's this open source project called Goto Editor, and it's a game engine, open source game engine. And the way they integrated with VS Code is pretty cool, but also the result of a pretty bad decision as well. So it's like they did something wrong, and because of that, they had to do something really good in order to integrate with VS Code or Eclipse Theia in this case. So what happens is that a game engine or even a game engine editor is something super complicated to implement, right? And they did all this work in C++, and they're now using Vulkan, which is a very complex API that doesn't exist in the browser. In the browser, you would have WebGL maybe. So anyway, it would be a mess to port this into a web context. But so what they did instead is that you run both instances at the same time. So on one side, you would have the editor running locally. Of course, it works only with local application in this case, but the ID could be extended to web as well. And so with the two instances side by side, when you are handling the editor, the Godot editor, what happens is that if you try to edit a script, if you try to edit a game script, it will send a message to VS Code implemented by the VS Code Godot extension, and it will send a message to VS Code telling it, hey, open this file, please, in the editor. And when the file is opened, language intelligence is provided by a language server running in the editor, the Godot editor, accessed through a socket. So essentially, the two are interconnected, and while the Godot editor is opened, it acts as a language server. And what this shows, essentially, is that even though they didn't try to embed the whole editor into VS Code, you still benefit from a very nice integration. And I was referring to a mistake they made, and the mistake is that the game scripts are written in a language that only the Godot editor implemented in C++ knows how to parse. I'm so sorry. But and because it only knows how to parse it, this is why the language server is running within the Godot editor itself. It's because the way the code is organized in their case, they cannot extract it, refactor it into its own little thing that you can run on the side. So you're stuck with having to run the full instance instead and connect to it from VS Code. But in this case, it's one of the best mechanisms you could put in place. So I'll try to go quickly because I don't know if I have a lot of time left. So it's going to be a bit random, but it should give you also better ideas about how to work with the applications and interesting use cases. So first and foremost, it's interesting to understand what happens when you build a Theia application. So there's a couple of folders that are auto-generated for you. And mainly, it generates a server, a backend, and something to run in your browser, so the front end. And with that, in the case of the front end, we also generate everything in order to bundle it so that it can easily be served. But we also have a mechanism in order to customize a little bit how the backend relates to its front end. This is the backend application server symbol. It's something that in your Theia extension, through your bindings, you can rebind with an implementation of your choice. And one such implementation could be to not serve the front-end bundles that were generated locally, but to only run the backend and then the front end is actually served by someone else, like a content delivery network. And this way you can have a bit more lightweight servers to host in your workspaces, and they wouldn't have to distribute the front end and keep it. So you minimize essentially the size of what you put in your containers. Speaking of containers, I had the occasion to work with some teams that were trying to put Theia into them. And so there's a couple of things to be said about Theia in a container. So people more experienced than me, for instance, in the Eclipse share, would maybe, like if anything is wrong in those slides, please correct me. But the idea of Docker images is that it's easier to consume Theia because then people don't need to build it or whatever, they just load an image, run it. The problem with that is, from experience, the image you build for Theia tend to become really big. And with the more features you try to add, the bigger they get and it never goes down. So what I mean by this is whenever you want to make a container for Theia, you usually start your image by trying to build it. So you need to install all the build tools and everything. And we got ways around this with multi-stage builds of the Docker images, which allows us to do this building step with all these dependencies and to get rid of everything we don't need later. But then you need to install Node. So now your image includes Node in order to run Theia. And now you have a choice to do. So now you have Theia ready to be run, but you need to decide what will be the development tools you need to put in the container for people to work as well. Like, do you want to develop on Java? Do you want to develop on Python? You need to install all of these runtimes and tools. And the more you want to be able to do, the more you need to cram into this image. So one of the ideas was to allow people to instead forget about building Theia into the image and then installing the tool at the same time, but instead to try and create an image with only your development tools and somehow then figure out a way to get Theia to interface with this environment. So we've seen already that you can build Theia into this image. Something that I think Che now does is inject the editors into the containers. So it's not at the image or build time, it's when you run the container and then you inject it inside as a second step right after running the container. And a different approach apparently that was also tried by Che was the sidecars. So essentially they would build just one image specifically to run the Theia editor, and they would have a different container with the development environment. The problem is that now you need to get each container to, you need at least the editor to see and to use the tools from the other containers. And you can usually achieve that with some kind of customization. You can write either a Theia extension, but I think it would work with a VS Code extension if you are able to open terminals through the VS Code API and SSH into the other container, for instance. It means that then the terminal you will have access to in Theia will technically be a remote session through SSH into the other one. That's just one idea. Maybe it can be done in a different way. And I would like to insist on, or maybe put an emphasis on injecting a pre-built Theia app in the container. This is something we played with. I still think it's a good idea. But the problem is Theia, by being a node or NPM application, it's quite hard to move around. You can, but it's a bit awkward to do. So the idea was, all right, let's take Theia Blueprint. In case you don't know, this is some kind of blueprint or template application that you can inspire yourself from when building a Theia IDE. This is specifically built for Electron, so desktop application, not a browser one. But I have a branch where I tried to create a configuration for it to work in the browser, this Blueprint code base. And the goal was to, once we have this browser version, to compress it down to an executable and maybe a few folders, but to have something that is easily put in a zip, and then that you can move around and extract in your environment and just run without having to install Node, because the executable would also contain Node. Turns out it's pretty difficult to do. Although the PR I had worked, it highlighted a lot of issues that would need to be addressed in order to properly support this use case. So first and foremost, we are trying to put a lot of things into a pro executable file, and so the front end that we serve in the browser is easily bundled, because if you want to serve things in the browser, bundling is a very common technology. So the Theia front end was designed with this in mind, but the back end, nope. So it was quite difficult to bundle this server, because essentially the server relies a lot on reflection and introspections of its environment. It expects a bunch of things to be in its non-modules folder, but this doesn't exist because everything must be bundled and crammed into a few files. So your tree structures are basically destroyed. And that's a problem. When you spawn sub-processes, because VS Code extensions need to spawn, for instance, language servers. And when you do that, then you need to be able to instruct this small bundle, like how to load those files, and etc. It's quite a mess. And ultimately, there was also a bug in the so in the package we used in order to create this final executable. I'm very sorry about this. Anyway, what happens is that they have their own build of Node, where they essentially have a bunch of patches for different versions. So they have patches for, I'm talking Git patches for Node 12, 14, 16, 18. And because in order to cram the Node runtime and your application code into one executable, you have to do a lot of things. And so they came up with their own custom builds, but turns out that the modifications they did to this Node source code in the binaries make it incompatible with some of the behavior that we can experience trying to deal with some extensions. I think it's the TypeScript plugin that tries to spawn the language server with an execrv to augment the memory. And because of the bug in this library, it fails. And I tried to fix it and failed. So since then, priorities for my work have changed. So this has been put on ice. But if anyone wants to look into this use case, I still think that we will eventually get back to this one. It's just, yeah, it will be just a prototype or proof of concept for now. And I'm sorry again about this, but I had a lot of things, a small example, but we are running a bit out of time. So let me check. If anyone is interested to talk to me after this talk, I had, so just the quick summary is that I wanted to interview people with, and I wanted to see them work on code, and I wanted to distribute a Theia application. The issue with that is that the server was using to host the Theia application. I didn't, it was mine, and I was giving out my IP to people, and I didn't want them to connect without being authenticated. And so I implemented a very quick and silly portal application that sits in front of my server that allows me to create sessions for people connecting to it. And if they are outside the allocated time for the interview, they will just be refused. And if they are within that time range, it will spawn a small process with everything they need to get a Theia instance running and everything. I know it's authentication is something that people asked us in open source, but it's not one of the mission goals of the framework. It's not a problem that we're trying to solve with Theia. This is left for other projects to figure out. But if you're interested into this little solution, feel free to talk to me about it if you want to know more after that. That concludes my presentation. Sorry for it being a bit hectic, but if you have any questions, I can run to someone.
Question. Do you want me to run around with the mic?
You can.
You can keep sitting then, I mean.
Yeah. Yes.
It's easy. While you're doing the packaging in Docker images, did you consider building in layers? So like each extension would be a different layer?
Extension, a layer. But then how do you consume each layer?
Basically, composition of the layers on top. Because you need something that can have multiple inheritance. Yeah, just for network performance. So like if that extension didn't change, you don't want to re-download it. So that kind of thing.
All right, yeah, that makes sense. But you're still assuming that we will have a lot of extensions, or within the same container. And how to put this? It would work technically, but I think there would be other problems. Any other questions?
Because I'm holding the mic. That's why.
Sure.
One question. A question regarding the experiment you did with the Theia browser package. So what I didn't understand is what was the motivation for this if the electron already exists. So the output of this electron is like an exe which you can then install and you can run it. So why basically redo this again for the browser?
Are you suggesting that there is an easier way to do it for the browser? Because it's true that we have an executable version and installable for the desktop version, but not for the browser. And we've considered using Electron because if we are able to package for the desktop using Electron, maybe we can do the same for the web. But it turned out to be quite overkill and not as straightforward as trying to do things properly.
Okay, it was just a misunderstanding on my side. So you wanted a reusable browser variant, which is basically a fat binary which you can run on the server.
Exactly, and this is the output of this work. I had a small archive with just one executable and a few plugins in a folder, and I could move that around without rebuilding anything, essentially.
Thank you.
What was your favorite slide?
Bob and Alice. Yeah.
So I'll end it on that note then. Thank you, everyone, and if there's no more question, have a good day.